Hello. It is day 32 of reading The Power Broker. I think he might finally break power. It's so nice outside. I kind of am sad that I'm not outside right now, but I gotta read the book because I took yesterday off. Okay, the top of page 239 at the start of but not like exactly the top. It's a few lines in. Okay. If the press erred in its description of Moses' achievements, it erred on the side of under, not overstatement. Long Island was only one segment of his state park system. The $14 million allocated for upstate parks in the bond issue was not nearly enough for the system he had in mind. Many of his hurried trips around the state were, therefore, attempts to persuade wealthy men who owned underdeveloped land in scenic areas to give their land to the public. Luckily, many of these men were the old park patriots. The state had never bothered to buy a single foot of Lake George's hundreds of miles of shoreline, and cheap resorts and rooming houses were proliferating on its shores. Lumbermen had stripped the surrounding mountains of their softwood forests and were starting on the hardwoods. The denuded soil was being washed away by rains. By midway along the lake, a branch of water jutted out to the northwest, and of the 11,000 virgin acres on the tongue of land thus formed, most of it called Tongue Mountain, 6,000 were owned by a group of wealthy men who were also public-spirited. He persuaded them to donate their land to the state. The remaining 5,000 acres on the tongue were owned by a family that was about to sell it to a lumbering company, but the family's attorney was Captain N. Taylor Phillips, a key figure in that stronghold of the Park Patriots, the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. Okay, there is a little friend that is possibly joining us. Oh, no, she's not. Pearl, come on. Come hang out by the book. It's so fun. Oh, I don't know. She's right here. Also, I haven't put anything on the walls in my room yet, so it looks a little bit like a psychiatric hospital in here, but I'll get around to it. If you have any great ideas for wall art, let me know. I feel like I'm kind of picky, so then I just end up with emptiness, which is not great. Okay, here she is. Is she gonna make an appearance? Perfect. Okay, the family's attorney was Captain N. Taylor Phillips, a key figure in that stronghold of the Park Patriots, the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. Working through Phillips, Moses persuaded the family to lower its asking price from $40 per acre to $15. And when he bought the whole tract, he had succeeded in preserving for posterity a substantial part of the Lake George region for a total cost of $75,000. What a steal. With the money he had saved, Moses preserved the historic battlefields at Fort Stanton and Oriskany, and with Adolph Oakes' help at Saratoga. Wait, these are like way upstate. This is not close to New York City at all. I want to get the star in the shot. He purchased the 10,692 still untouched acres of Whiteface Mountain, which he had so often climbed as a youth, thus ensuring that generations of youths who came after him would also be able to climb it. By the end of the summer of 1928, the scattered little historic reservations that Moses had inherited had been expanded into a system that included 70 parks totaling more than 125,000 acres. And he had used $5 million of the bond issue to beat the lumbermen to great untouched tracts in the Adirondacks and Catskills and build up the state's forest preserve to 2,218,000 acres. When he had the parks, Moses built roads to link them with the nearest highways. And suddenly, families in Rochester and Syracuse and Albany were visiting places they had never heard of before. Not only Letchworth Gorge and Watkins Glen, but Boonville Gorge, Rudd Pond, Roaring Brook, and Ore Pit. If they simply wanted to drive through these parks, there were gravel roads they could do that on. If they wanted to hike, there were hiking paths and nature trails through the woods. If they wanted to swim, there were paths down to beautiful hidden mountain lakes and bathhouses in which they could change into swimming outfits. If they wanted to picnic, there were picnic grounds of which every detail was designed to preserve the fresh, virgin quality of the woods. If they wanted to camp out, there were campsites designed with equal care, laid out next to the cool mountain brooks. Newspapers in Rochester rhapsodized over Letchworth State Park. Newspapers in Albany over Thatcher State Park. Newspapers in Buffalo over the park on Devil's Island that overlooked Niagara Falls. But these newspapers had little interest in the Long Island parks, and New York City newspapers had little interest in the upstate parks. So no newspaper, no matter how enthusiastic it was over what editorial writers called Robert Moses's Great Park Program, comprehended the full extent of the program's magnitude, or the full extent of its greatness. Perhaps the most remarkable characteristic of these parks and parkways that were becoming physical realities in 1928 was that they were, for the most part, the parks and parkways he had proposed in the New York State Association park reports he had written in 1922 and 23. They were located in the places he had proposed, and the details of their development, down to the facades of their bathhouses and how many lockers and parking spaces each would have, followed the plans Moses had made for them. Robert Moses had a dream immense in scope. By the end of the summer of 1928, the dream, all of the dream, even Jones Beach, which had seemed doomed to diminution, I don't know how to pronounce that word, but to like diminu. It seemed dim to diminution in reality, was either reality or well on its way to becoming reality. Chapter 14, Changing. We're on a new chapter. Are you excited? Oh, you can't really. I want it to look like she's reading. Okay. Chapter 14, page 241. Lashed by his desire for the realization of his dreams, Bob Moses had changed even before he became president of the Long Island State Park Commission on April 18, 1924. From the idealist who put his faith in trust and reason to the pragmatist who put his faith in power. But the acquisition of power in his own name on that date and his use of power thereafter broadened the change, accelerated it, intensified it, and raised it to an entirely new level. For once, Bob Moses came into possession of power. It began to perform its harsh alchemy on his character, altering its contours, eating away at some traits, allowing others to enlarge. The potential for these changes had always been there, like a darker shadow on the edge of the bright gold of his idealism. With each small increase in the amount of power he possessed, the dark element in his nature had loomed larger, becoming prominent enough for sharp-eyed men to begin to notice it. Had not Reuben Lazarus said, when Smith brought him up to Albany, he began to be, quite suddenly and quite noticeably, a lot more arrogant. Such men concluded that Moses, even more than most other men, liked power in and for itself. Some of them suspected that if Moses ever obtained in substantial measure power of his own, the alteration in his character would become a transformation. But even sharp-eyed men could not be prepared for the extent of the transformation. For adulthood was, after all, only part of the pattern of Moses' life, and they had not seen the other part of the pattern. They could not know, therefore, how far back in the overall pattern the dark thread ran. They could not know how inextricably it was knotted into the pattern's most central design. They had seen Moses' fingers drum impatiently on the table while someone dared to disagree with him. But they had never seen drumming impatiently another set of fingers. They had seen Bob Moses tilt back his head and look down his nose in the prosecutor's stance, but not having known Moses in his boyhood, they couldn't know where the tilt came from. They may have known Bob Moses, but they did not know Bob Moses' mother. They did not know Bob Moses' grandmother, and therefore they could not know the origin or the depth of his susceptibility to the infection of power. Whoa. They could not know that the susceptibility lay not in Albany, but in family, in heredity, or upbringing, or some combination of the two. He was Bella Moses' son, the one of her children most like her, the one in whom surfaced most strongly the mixed strain of passionate idealism and overweening arrogance that she had inherited from her parents, Granny and Bernhard Cohen. When the idealism died, the arrogance was already well rooted and strong. If it was given nourishment, it would expand. And power feeds arrogance. As Moses obtained power, therefore, the traits symptomatic of his arrogance became steadily more noticeable. The pattern's hue darkened. His mother had always displayed, as a Madison House trustee and as a wife, a conviction of her own infallibility and a predisposition to impose her will on others, an unwillingness to listen to others, and a burning impatience to see her solutions to problems implemented to capital G, get, capital T things, capital D done. Get things done. Moses' imagination seemed most easily fired, as his mother's had been, by physical problems and physical solutions, problems that could be solved by construction, by the shaping of concrete and steel. And the resemblance in traits between mother and son went beyond that. As a staffer at the Bureau of Municipal Research, he had displayed the same dogmatism and the same impatience. Bob Moses had wanted his own way, and he had wanted it when he wanted it. And now that he had power, he was going to see that he got it. He had never wanted to listen to people who disagreed with him. Now, in the main, he didn't have to. When he talked to Ricards Leonard W. Hall, then a state assemblyman, he'd just tell you what he was going to do. If you disagreed with him and tried to explain your feelings or even started asking questions, he would cut right in, slash at you without answering the questions, making you feel stupid for asking. And if you were talking to him on the phone, he'd just hang up on you. I remember talking to him on the phone and disagreeing with him about something, and I was in the middle of a sentence, and the damn phone was slammed down. I think I scared Pearl. Sorry, Pearl. Moses had always displayed contempt for people he felt were considerably beneath him. The subject people of the British Empire, for example, or civil servants who hadn't attended Oxford or Cambridge. At the Municipal Civil Service Commission, his irritation at having to interrupt his work for public hearings indicated a tendency to feel that the public he was serving was beneath him, that its suggestions about its own destiny were not worth listening to. Now that feeling about the public was intensified. When the governor's office received a letter making a suggestion about parks or criticizing one of the regional commissions, the letter was invariably referred by George Graves, Smith's secretary, to Moses for a suggested reply that could be sent back over the governor's signature. Now, more and more frequently, Moses would suggest that no one bother to reply at all. His contempt was not limited to the public. It included, apparently, most state legislators. If he wasn't hanging up on them in mid-sentence, he was treating them with extravagant disdain. Quote, they didn't dislike him just because politically he was cutting them to pieces, Hall recalls. They disliked him personally. He acted with complete arrogance. He insulted those men to their face. Sniffing at the patronage possibilities at Jones Beach as though they were sea air, Senate Finance Commission Chairman Jeremiah F. Twomey of Brooklyn asked Moses to drop around for a chat before the Finance Committee hearings on a Jones Beach appropriation bill. According to Hall, to whom Twomey told the story, oh, Pearl, I want her more in the shot. She is the power broker. Okay. Twomey says, Bob, it looks like there will be a lot of jobs out there, and I was wondering if we could get a couple. Bob answers very softly, very gently, very politely. What did you have in mind, Jerry? He asks. Jerry mentions one job, and Moses says very softly, very politely, Do you have anything else on your mind, Jerry? Jerry, completely taken in, thinking that for once this fellow is going to be reasonable, mentions a couple of other jobs, and Moses says, Do you have anything else on your mind, Jerry? Jerry says, Well, that's about all. And Moses says, Jerry, you can take that bill and stick it up your ass. Moses had always been impatient. Most men didn't move fast enough for him. Now he could do something about it. The park philanthropists on the State Council of Parks didn't move fast enough for him. There were many reasons. For one thing, most of the regional commissions whose chairmen comprised the council were made up of men with a different philosophy of parks from his. This was understandable. They were, in the main, elderly men out of the days when parks had meant conservation rather than recreation. Even during the 1920s, of course, parks still meant conservation to most park servants. There wasn't one in the country who would lean as heavily as Moses to thinking of parks as baseball fields and tennis courts rather than as glades and forests and hiking trails. The regional commissioners, men of the older era, had become interested in parks to preserve as much of nature's beauties as possible from a ruthless civilization. When they saw the developer's bulldozer imperiling a favorite piece of woodland, they purchased the woodland with their own money and presented it to the state. And when they realized that the state would not provide sufficient funds to preserve it as it should be preserved, they put up the money themselves, year after year, and they put up their time, too, spending weekends and vacations on inspection trips, often making needed repairs with their own hands. In drawing up their wills, they chose carefully the men they wanted to administer the properties after they were gone, and these men, too, felt that preserving the properties in the condition in which they had received them was a sacred trust. Proposals for huge parking fields, for restaurants, these seemed to them to conflict with the ideals they had sworn themselves to preserve. If the state now wanted to develop those parks, well, certainly some development was necessary. As long as it was done slowly and carefully, it could be worked out. But they wanted to make sure that the development did not destroy the natural qualities they treasured. There were other reasons too. For Moses' impatience with the regional commissioners. At bottom, the philosophy of government on which they had been weaned emphasized the rights of the individual. They believed, therefore, that governmental power should be used with the utmost restraint. They were, frankly, dismayed by the way Moses had used entry and appropriation against Havemeyer and Macy, by the way he had threatened to use it against the North Shore Barons. And they didn't intend to use such techniques themselves, even if using slower techniques meant that parks and parkways in their areas wouldn't be acquired as fast as Moses wanted. A more important source of conflict in their dealings with Moses, however, had nothing to do with philosophy. It was simply that the old men wanted to remain in charge of the parks they loved. Moses had let them believe that they would remain in charge. He had given them no hint of his true purposes. For Moses had needed them. He had needed their prestige, their reputation, as strong with legislators as with the public, for uprightness, for unselfishness, and for devotion to the cause of the parks. He had needed the backing of their names. The audience cocktail chatter on this week's Slate Political Gabfest featured a slight digression about the power broker. Oh, fun. I don't listen to that podcast. Maybe I should. I've really been tapping out of political podcasts lately because anything about the U.S. election makes me really depressed. But I kind of like those roundtable type podcasts. Like I remember the 538 podcast. I don't know if it's still good now that 538 got bought out by what, ABC or Disney or something. But I remember it used to be kind of good. At least I liked it. Oh, I know I'm biased because she's my own cat, but I just think Pearl is so cute. All right, Pearl. Moses is about to screw over the longtime elderly park servants. Let's watch. And they had given him that backing. During the debate over the $15 million bond issue, they had made use of their influence in their home counties to mute upstate resentment towards such a large spending proposal. Judge Ellis J. Stanley of Albany had spoken night after night to civic groups in Albany, Troy, and Schenectady. Judge Alphonse Trumbore Clearwater, elderly and ailing. That's the name Alphonse. Why did that one fall out of favor? I feel like Alphonse really could come back in a huge way. Okay, elderly and ailing had climbed out of a sick bed in Kingston. Okay, what? Oh, sorry, I keep doing digressions, but the fact that I'm not aware. I wasn't aware that this was a thing, but sick bed is just one word. He was in his sick bed. It's a sick bed you have over there. Sick bed, dude. Okay, so he climbed out of his sick bed in Kingston to tour Ulster County so successfully that that bastion of conservatism had, to Al Smith's astonishment, actually given the referendum a majority. During the Taylor estate fight, the old parkmen had let Smith invoke their names. Everyone knows Justice Clearwater, that was the quote, to dramatize the fact that even these dyed-in-the-wool Republicans could not support the Republican legislative proposals for parks. GOP leaders had told them that Smith was using them to destroy their party. Many of the park men had felt there was some truth in this, but parks came first with them. And when Smith, through Moses, had asked them to come to Albany, they had come. They had given Moses the help he asked because they believed what he had told them. When he assured them, as he did over and over and over, both in letters and to their faces, that under his park plan they would continue their duties and powers, that they would continue to administer the parks they loved, that the State Park Council was merely an advisory agency, they believed him. And when the bill creating the State Parks Council was signed, their leaders had elected him its chairman. But now, Moses didn't need them anymore. Ugh, can you believe it? Not a month after his election, Justice Staley, who administered John Boyd Thatcher Park near Albany for the American Scenic and Historical Preservation Society, routinely sent to the state a request for $15,000 to build a new caretaker's cottage. Sorry, I got so used to talking about $15 million that $15,000 was a little bit hard to even say. That's nothing. State officials told the astonished judge that all such requests now had to go through the State Parks Council through Moses, and Moses did not approve the request. The height of impertinence, Staley told the society's trustees. Wow. They agreed. Quote, "It is highly desirable," they said in the minutes of their meeting of May 26, 1924, "that there be a clear understanding of the difference between the powers of the council as a central advisory agency and the executive power of the existing commissions, boards, and organizations governing the parks." They got their clear understanding. When, during the summer of 1925, they submitted to the council their budget requests for 1926, Moses curtly disapproved many of them. When they tried to circumvent Moses by sending them to state budget officials as they had in the past, the officials sent them back telling them that under the new Parks Council law, all park budget requests had to be transmitted to the state through the council. At a council meeting at 261 Broadway, Judge Clearwater reminded Moses that the council's powers were advisory, not supervisory. Really? Moses replied coldly. Might he suggest that the judge read the law? The old parkman read the law and began to realize what they had done. That is crazy. Okay, then there's this is really weird formatting. There's just a bunch of line breaks with nothing, and then it says the realization grew, period. And then next paragraph. So this is some fun. This is fun. Moses had written, she doesn't look like she's comfortable, but I think she is. I don't know. If there's any cat experts in the chat, you can let me know. Moses had written the Parks Council bylaws. Of course he did. At the first meeting after he had been elected chairman, when he was still charming the old parkmen, they had approved them, believing them only a formality. Now, reading the bylaws, they realized that all power in the council was centralized in its chairman. The council's finance committee, the key unit which would weigh the requests of the regional commissions, was not elected by them but appointed by him. And he had appointed to 3 of its 5 places council staff members hired by and responsible only to the chairman. The whole council staff was responsible to the chairman, and this staff was empowered in the bylaws to draw up the plans for all state parks, including their state parks. The old men reluctantly decided that they would have to deny Moses a second 1-year term, and suddenly realized when they tallied up votes that while their commissions controlled a majority of the state parks, they did not control a majority of the state parks council. 6 of its 11 votes were in Moses' hands. Moses' own, 2 cast by Smith appointees not directly connected with parks, the State Conservation Commissioner, and the director of the State Museum. 3 cast by the presidents of 3 new regional commissions, which did not at the moment have any parks to administer, but which Moses had insisted, for reasons the old parkmen now understood, be represented on the council, and to which Smith had appointed men who would take Moses' orders. The old parkmen had many reservations about Moses' overall park policies, as well as about his plans for specific parks. For one thing, they were concerned about his eagerness to develop parks that were far outside city limits. Heckscher was 50 miles from Times Square. Letchworth, 50 miles from Rochester, without providing any means of transportation to them other than auto. The truly poor masses of the city didn't own automobiles, they pointed out. How were they to reach the parks? But every time they raised such points, they were voted down. And Moses was reelected to the chairmanship in 1925, 26, 27, and 28. New paragraph. Some of Moses' fights with the elderly park philanthropists could be viewed as conflicts of philosophy, as his determination not to allow his dreams to be thwarted by other men's smaller-scale vision. Although the closer one examines the details, the more it appears that the crucial conflict in each was between his demand for speed and their feeling that since once nature was altered by man, it could never be restored to its original condition. Any changes in the magnificent gorges and mountains which had been entrusted to them must be considered with painstaking care and designed to blend in with the existing topography. Semicolon. The American scenic and historic, really rare to have semicolons. He doesn't do, I don't know why I'm reading into this so much, but he's so big on dashes. He puts commas in really just clauses are everywhere with commas. Not so many semicolons. The American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society, for example, did not object to making Letchworth State Park more accessible to the public and to furnishing accommodations for families wanting to stay overnight, semicolon. They just wanted the proposed inn and large adjoining parking garage built on the rim of the beautiful Genesee River gorge rather than right at its heart, as Moses proposed. On other battles between Moses and the old parkmen, however, it is more difficult to place any philosophical interpretation. The nature of these fights hints that power was now, for the first time in his life, becoming an end in itself. That he was beginning to crave it now, not only for the sake of dreams, but for its own sake. That although, through his bill drafting, he had given himself much of the power in the field of parks, he was no longer satisfied with much of the power, that he now wanted all of the power in the field. The suspicion is aroused most strongly by his treatment of the commissioners of the state park at Niagara. That was a full paragraph. New paragraph. There were 5 Niagara commissioners, all of them elderly men, but the 2 most active had long been Judge Clearwater and Annesley Wilcox. New paragraph. I'm only pointing this out because he never does small paragraphs. So it's always like he's always really setting you up for a big punch. Okay, now it's a big, new, really long paragraph. Everyone knows Judge Clearwater, Smith had said, and in regard to the central tier, at least, the governor may have been very nearly right. At 77, Alphonse Trumbore Clearwater of Kingston was a legend throughout the band of thinly populated counties that stretched 300 miles across the middle of the state. Tall and thin, with a face that would have been cold were it not for the upward turn of the corners of his mouth, he was a wing-colored embodiment of devotion to the public good. He had been both district attorney of Ulster County and a lawyer who, in an era in which the poor often went unrepresented in court, represented the poor. And as both prosecutor and defender, his brilliance, and despite a dry and precise style, his remarkable oratorial ability made him a lawyer other lawyers feared to oppose. See, like the commas are crazy, you know? That was crazy. While still young, Judge Clearwater had been president of the State Bar Association and a justice of the State Supreme Court, semicolon. Maybe there have been semicolons that I just haven't noticed, but I feel like this is new. I feel like this is just signs of like an editor that went in and did this. And the editor was Robert Gottlieb, who's the same guy that edited a bunch of books. Like he was the one that in the book Catch 22, I think the original number was different. It was like a less memorable number, like Catch 15 or like Catch 47. And he was like 22 is way better and more memorable. And that became the title. And now it's just like, you know, it's a word. It's just like a common word, a Catch 22. Okay, anyway. Men said he could, had he wished, been governor. Justice Clearwater. Judge Clearwater, I mean. But he did not so wish. Instead of a politician, he became a historian, and he served his state by studying its history. Scholars regarded his knowledge as unequaled, and by selecting from appointments proffered by its governors, not those that would have brought him fame, but those that would enable him to help preserve its locales of history and beauty, such as Niagara State Park. His selflessness was widely known. Although he had renounced politics, his voice was regarded by politicians as the most influential in the central tier. When in 1925, a desperate Moses, assuring Clearwater that the Parks Council would be only an advisory body, had asked the judge to help him in the Taylor estate fight, he had come, old and ill, to Albany to stand before a hostile Republican caucus and argue in Moses's behalf. When legislators had begun criticizing Moses's spending proposals for Niagara as extravagant, Clearwater had written him a letter saying, "Your views are just," and that line of criticism had abruptly stopped. Weird. Of all the old parkmen, Clearwater had been Moses's most effective supporter. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Oh, you just control F semicolons and there are 4,000? Sorry, I'm being crazy, I guess. Okay, I'll tell you. The reason that I'm paying attention to semicolons is because yesterday, but 28 hours ago, short hours, I read this book in one sitting because it's really short, and it's called Semicolon, The Past, Present, and Future of a Misunderstood Mark. It was okay. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend it, unless you really like that sort of thing. But I think that's definitely just the reason why I'm primed to notice semicolons. Okay, sorry about my semicolon misinformation. I hope you have a good rest of your day. It's so nice in New York. It's like sunny and 60 something. I'm going to like a thing for someone's moving away party later. That'll be nice. Ooh. See you later.